which is Thursday. I like to say what day it is because sometimes I need that right now. We are very pleased today on our YWTV program to be able to kick off an important discussion in our national effort that YWCAs do called our Stand Against Racism. As you all know, our mission of our work at the YWCA is to eliminate racism and empower women. And so that really is our work every single day. But in the month of April, nationally, we all across the country make sure that there's special focus to bring attention to this discussion, which of course in the last few years has become even more important to continue having. And in the last few weeks, I think has really elevated, and the timing of having the Stand Against Racism in April during this time of the COVID crisis has really brought even more conversations to light. I would like to thank my two guests for joining me this morning. We're so happy to have Rev Willard Ashley Sr. He is the Vice Chair of the Bergen County Human Relations Commission, and he's also the co-chair of the Interfaith Anti-Racism Coalition in Greater New York City metropolitan area. And we just learned we're both hail from the same part of New York City. And that Anti-Racism Coalition is under the umbrella of the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. So thank you so much for being with us, Reverend. And I'm also very happy to share that he is one of this year's YWCA Racial Justice Award winners. And so we're looking forward to honoring him properly when we can get back to normal, whatever that is. And so happy to also have join us today, Christopher Kwok, Esquire. He is a co-chair of the Issues and Asia Practice Committee of the Asian American Bar Association of New York, and he's also a board member of the Asian American Federation. And thank you for joining us today, Christopher, as well.
Thank you for inviting me.
So before we jump into a conversation, I thought maybe I'd give you both an opportunity to tell us a little bit about your work before we kind of get a little bit more centric. Reverend, would you like to start?
Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for being able to be on Facebook Live. This is all new for me, but I'm enjoying it so far. So thank you. And thank you for honoring me whenever we can get together, whatever becomes our new normal, so to speak. So lately I've been doing work with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. They have a 2.5-day workshop, which some of the members of the Y have participated in that already. And they offer an analysis, a history, and leadership development around racism. They call it Undoing Racism. As an offshoot of that, I'm now the co-chair with AABANY Chapman of the Anti-Racist Coalition of Faith, Spiritual, and Ethical Communities. And we are engaged in a project called Taking It Inside. And Taking It Inside is saying, it's one thing to tell the rest of the world how racist you are and hold them accountable, but oftentimes we don't hold our own institutions accountable. And so we're doing work with about 35 different congregations where we are looking at how do we hold our own institutions accountable. We're in the infancy stages of it, but it's exciting work to do. And we look forward to how that progresses in light of the coronavirus and what that means for us. Secondly, I've been involved with a group called New Jersey Together. They are an affiliate of the Industrial Areas Foundation, Saul Alinsky type organizing. And some of the very things that you've mentioned are part of our agenda. We're also interested in criminal justice, sentencing guidelines, reentry, testing within the prison before people are released, testing housing and education. As you had mentioned, that I'm also a co-chair of the Human Relations Commission of Bergen County, and we have sponsored a workshop on implicit bias. And then lastly, I'm finishing up my new book, which I hope will be out in the fall, Rules for 21st Century Radicals. And it picks off where Saul Alinsky had left off, and where, a lot of things happened in the 50 years since his book has come out. But I want to include in my book a greater emphasis on race and racism.
Wonderful. I look forward to that for sure. Christopher, can you share a little bit about the work that you do?
Yeah, that's a hard act to follow. So I've been lucky enough to work for the federal government for a good portion of my career. I worked for 15 years at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in the New York office as a mediator. So I've had what I feel is a frontline seat on the racial issues that are at the heart, I think, of the American question. And I left last year, and I'm a private mediator now. But that's been sort of at the heart of the work that I've done in race relations. And I've been lucky enough to be a board member of the Asian American Federation and the Asian American Bar Association and work on issues of racism and the relationship of Asian Americans to the race issues and problems that exist in our country. So that's it.
That's wonderful. And I appreciate you
True.
both taking the time to be here. Having you both here is definitely going to help, one of our goals at the YWCA, which is definitely to enlist more people in our community to become civically engaged. And we do believe that that happens when we have conversations and that the conversations educate people and inspire them to take action. So we appreciate you being here to share your experiences and your research and your work to help us further our mission for our organization, which I know we all collectively live in that space for sure. So maybe we can start with something that when I talked to you earlier, I didn't even mention, maybe the census a little bit. I mean, we are in the time of census gathering. And the YWCA is one of the organizations that has received a census grant, and that we're working with our community to make sure that the counts are high and that everyone understands the importance of sharing that. Can you talk a little bit from your communities about the importance of the census and some work maybe that you're doing there?
I think I think it's important for both of our communities to make sure that everyone is counted. We know how districts get rezoned and reconfigured, and so it's very important that all of us are counted. I think one of the challenges is telling people that may or may not be comfortable with giving out their information that it's
Yes.
okay and that it's needed. That to me is like the biggest contribution that I think that I can make, saying that A, that we need to count you, and that B, that it's safe. You're safe.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, for the Asian American population, immigration status and sort of the news that they've seen in the last 3 years has really scared a lot of the members of the Asian American community from governmental interactions. That's always been an issue. Linguistic ability has also been an issue. Communication. So with the change in the politics and along with the existing sort of linguistic and cultural sort of trust issues, that's always going to be a really high bar for Asian American populations to participate in the census so they can be properly counted. And of course, the Asian American grouping in America is very diverse, very big, composed of a lot of different groups, some of which are very new to America. And so all of those are challenges for the Asian American community.
Yeah, a few weeks ago, we had a conversation specifically around the census, and really talked about the confidentiality piece, and obviously the importance of getting everyone counted. So I'm happy to have you both share your thoughts on that. So the census is something we've obviously in the YW been focused on right now because this is a right now issue. But one of the areas that we've really been focused on for the long haul every year. And some years are, every year is important, but this year I think is especially important, is really around voter registration and protecting voter rights are two of the areas that, we like to focus our efforts and energies. And, specifically for us at the YWCA is making sure that we get more women of color thinking about running for office and supporting them so that they can actually hold elected office. This is really some of the foundation of the work that we do at the YW. So in thinking about voter registration and protecting voter rights, I'm interested in hearing, both of your thoughts on that discussion. Chris, maybe you want to start?
Yeah, voter rights, voter protection. The Asian American population in New York has only recently, in the last 20 years, had electeds in New York City government, at the state level, and at the federal level. And so we're still a relatively new population, even though Asian populations have been in America for a long time. They were relatively small and not engaged in the political participation. But post 65 immigration changes, and then with about a 30 years sort of gap after that, we've seen sort of beginnings of political participation. But speaking from New York City and New York City area, it's still a work in progress in terms of the political power and the political participation of Asian Americans in the process. And it's still an issue of getting voters out. Relative to the numbers, people are not registered to vote. They're not politically engaged. And I do hope that given the changes that we're going through right now, the pandemic, I hope that it will result in a different political participation level, much higher after this, coming out of this.
Yes, I would hope so. Are there any thoughts on your end about how we can increase, and obviously a lot of our work is in Bergen County, Essex County, Passaic County, Morris County, and Hudson counties is, our area. But of course, nationally, for anyone listening, ways that we can increase voter registration in the Asian American communities, work that we can do?
I think the argument needs to be made to Asian Americans as to why it's important. And I think that, if you don't understand the political process, if you don't understand how state and city budgets work, if you don't understand that your interests won't matter if your vote is not counted, then I think that that's when you get people out. That's when they have their political awakening. I think other groups have had different periods of political awakening, and they have different circumstances, so they understand. You don't have to explain a lot to them. I think for new Asian immigrants, the first 20 or 30 years is about survival. Like once they get to this country, it's about not starving. It's about having your kids go through school. And then like afterwards, in some ways, political participation is a luxury for immigrants, right? For their children. Their children will speak English. Their children are educated here. Their children will have a better sense of the political issues and get it, right? And so that's why it's taken, I think, a generation really, at least for Asian Americans to sort of begin to get involved. And it's slow. A lot of the old rules were meant to prevent people from political participation. If you know the history, these rules were not meant to make it easy. These rules were actually meant to preserve the old guard, keep them in power, and they've been in power a long time. And so I think all of those issues are hard, both on the sort of the Asian American population end, and then once they get involved, the system end is a challenge.
So it sounds like some good old-fashioned community organizing, to get to the people.
That's right.
Yeah. Reverend, what are your thoughts on the topic?
Give away my age, perhaps, but I remember very vividly when John Lindsay walked the streets of Washington Heights and said, "Get out and vote, register and get out and vote." And I remember when David Dinkins stopped playing tennis in Riverside Drive Park and encouraged us to go register and to vote. And so it's very important that we're registered. It's very important that we vote. I remember talking to a U.S. senator once I began my work here in New Jersey, and I'd asked that senator, because of the size of my congregation, I had that senator's ear, and I asked for something that impacted the community. He says, "Well, I'm not sure if I want to do that or not, Reverend." And I said, "Well, why not?" He says, "Because if I don't, your folks don't vote. I pay no consequence." Now that was many years ago, not current administration, but still that stayed with me. And so ever since that conversation, I've always made it my personal agenda, my professional agenda, to get people to register to vote. If you don't register, you don't have a bat in your hand. You can't take a swing, because they're right. There's no consequence for not for not adhering to the things that you request and that you ask for. I've been fortunate that on every other Sunday evening, there's a national call of all the major mental health professionals in the African American community. And one of the major agenda items is to get people registered to vote. And we are learning that where before we'd have television ads and so forth, that more and more younger people are using YouTube and Facebook, and so to put the message on in those mediums as well, so that we use all the various technological and media opportunities before us to say it's important that you vote. Understanding history, John F. Kennedy won the presidency by what, less than 1 percentage point. So it's important that your vote does count, your voice matters.
So it's interesting. I mean, you talked about some of the new ways that we're getting the word out about voter registration. And I know that many people watching are, out there working for different organizations, on this specific issue. For each of your areas, how are you're focusing getting out the vote and getting people registered? Is it using those mediums now? Is it just good old fashioned, hitting? I mean, we can't hit the road like we used to right now. So it's an interesting time. How are we, how can we make some of those connections right now to still get people thinking about registering and to Chris's point, with the lens of what's happening right now, hopefully it's become even more important for folks to understand why they need to vote. But what are some of the tools we can use to get out there?
And go ahead, Chris.
No, please.
Oh, in congregational work, we're finding that through the imams, the rabbis, the priests, the pastors, the spiritual leaders, making sure that they understand the importance of why we should vote and sharing that information with the congregations, making sure that we have relationships with community centers, with organizations that historically have pushed voting rights and voter registration, making new connections with other organizations, not-for-profits, and sharing the importance of voting, making people aware that where we are very much involved in a pandemic, people in power are plotting the next move. And so while we're doing the funerals and taking care of people's basic needs, we can't fall asleep on the very real need that it's important that we're registered and that our vote counts.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for Asian American communities, one of the most effective things to get people politically involved is to identify key issues that will get people out. And once you get them out into the community, into a community forum, into other types of civic participation, then I think you can begin to talk about the process of registering to vote and voting. I think just saying register and vote is great, and those drives should exist. But I think that for Asian American populations specifically, you have to sort of put the issue out there before you make the sell, before you make the pitch, because you have to say, you care about that issue, you want that politician to go a certain way. Well, great. Now you understand, you've got to vote. And that's been, I think, effective. And, I think for Asian American civic leaders, it's about figuring out what issues move the Asian American population, and then being able to communicate that in a way to get people out. Education has been a big issue. And hopefully, if you look at, let's say, Chinatown and the Chinese areas in New York City, they were the first to feel the economic fallout of the pandemic. Businesses were down 50 to 80% in January and February. So they were really hit hard early. And many Chinese restaurants are still closed completely throughout this pandemic. And, I think perhaps the pitch there, once we come out of this, is to say, hey, did you get any federal help? Did you get any of those funds? Did you get those things? And I'm sure many of them didn't. So I think that those are the political issues that we need to identify for them and encourage them to participate, because otherwise, how are they going to get to those funds that were meant for them, but went to a university with $1 billion endowment.
Right.
This is saying, and clearly you're correct. All politics is local, and you're right. The pitch is issue driven. I think in the African American community we have an additional historic memory. I remember, as long as I could remember, my dad saying, "So many people died for your right to vote. If you want to live in this household, once you're able to vote, your butt's going to the polls to vote." And I think that's important for us.
So, the YWCA, obviously being a nonprofit, is a, nonpartisan organization from that perspective. But I do think that you both make some really important points about, doing a general drive to get people to vote is helpful, but that you really do have to, tug at someone, inspire them, to motivate them to, take that next step and file the paperwork or go online and do what is needed and then get themselves to the poll. So let's talk about what issues, in your communities that should be, like a focus of a discussion. But then I guess then after, maybe we can look at it under the lens of COVID-19, because I think that, there may be some, there's definitely another conversation to be had about, the time we're living in right now. But, what are some of the issues? I know, Chris, you just mentioned, obviously, the economic issues of getting access to the funding to be able to keep their businesses, afloat.
Yeah.
I can totally see that that's a key one always, but especially now.
Right. I think for Asian Americans, looking at, if you look at the death rates, you look at the infection rates for COVID-19, Asian Americans actually have come out with the statistics that we have so far. They've done pretty well health-wise in terms of the infection and death rates. I think the big concern for Asian Americans is anti-Asian violence, anti-Asian sort of assaults. The children, right? Hey, if you're in a class and the Asian kids, they're the ones that bought the flu, and so that revival of anti-Asian discrimination is a big issue for me. And for the Asian American community. We want to be able to deal with, I think, the hate crimes that have arisen as a result of this. But obviously, that's not the only thing. I think we need to also look at the larger structural issues, because this has impacted African American and Latino populations dramatically. And we need to look at the structural reasons for that. And I think the Asian American population, at the same time, being very, very vigilant about the rise of anti-Asian harassment, needs to think about its fitting within the structural sort of system of discrimination and racism that have impacted sort of these communities. Many of whom in Queens, where I grew up, that are right next to each other. Corona, Elmhurst, they've been hit the hardest. Parts of the Bronx are the worst. You look at the map and it's ridiculous. You overlay it with the racial demographics and the COVID-19 demographics, and it's a crying shame. It's a crime, For
sure. Reverend?
I think we should just put the yellow tape around the whole country. It's been a crime scene. COVID-19 has exposed the sins of the church, systems, politicians, and our lack of preparedness. As it relates to specifically to African Americans, healthcare is a huge issue. As the CDC says, that at least 1/3 of the COVID-related deaths are African Americans. We're only 13% of the population. And I have personal, professional experiences of access to care is almost impossible. And some of the protocols just aren't realistic. So saying that you have to have a physician write you a note to be tested, that works for me. I have great health insurance. I have a personal internist that can do that, but I have congregants who, for them, that's not their reality. I'm glad that I'm on the call with my colleague from downtown, because I was confronted with social distancing sounds great, but that's very middle class thinking. That there are lots of places where that's not possible. And what does that mean for places where that's not possible? So, for example, one of my members said, Rev, here's the deal. I live on the 20th floor in a housing project. Only one elevator operates, and I have my groceries in my hand. You do the math.
Yeah.
I
That's
got
right.
it. I understand. Or persons who are saying that because of I live in a studio or a one-room apartment with 5 other people. So and we share one bathroom, share one kitchen. So there are places where that sounds great, but that's not reality. That's not possible. And people are doing the best that they can in that regard. So healthcare is a big issue. Access to healthcare. We've heard the horror stories in Queens, in New Jersey, in the Bronx, of women of color in particular saying, I'm sure I have the virus, I'm sure I have the symptoms, and being turned away, and in some cases, dying at home or dying before they could be seen by someone. And we understand that for many African Americans that have hypertension, cholesterol issues, other asthma, other pre-existing conditions, that only makes the problem worse. I look to Serena Williams and I say, gee, she has social status, she has the class status, she has the economic status. But when she said, I don't feel well, she became just another black person. And no one believed her. She said, Mommy, I'm a trained athlete. I
Yeah.
know my body. Something's not right. So if she has that kind of a challenge, imagine all the black women and people of the African diaspora that are
Mm,
saying something's wrong and no one's
who's
listening.
listening? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, I really want to add to that, and because my career has been as an employment lawyer, one of the things that have really and really consistent with what the Reverend said, it's about the essential worker, and we rightly celebrate our medical care professionals and everyone that works in the hospitals. We do; they deserve it all. But when De Blasio talked about a parade for them, I thought, hey, where are the
Mm,
baggers, the
yeah.
cashiers from the supermarkets, where are the bus drivers, the subway operators, um, the those essential workers that actually don't have health care, that
Yeah.
don't have paid leave. Those are the people I think coming out of this, a large percentage of whom are African American and Latino,
Mm-hmm.
that we've designated essential, which means you need to come in if you want to get paid. Not a lot of money to begin with.
Right.
And so they have essentially become our essential but expendable workers. And I think we need to say essential and essential. So if it's essential and essential, they need to have what healthcare workers have: stability in their workplace. They need to have healthcare. Then they have to have paid sick leave, and that's no longer a crazy liberal left progressive
Mm-hmm.
dream that Bernie
Mm-hmm.
Sanders is screaming about. Is actually something that we've said. Thank you for being an essential worker, because you've made me able to stay home, not go out and have my groceries delivered to my front door. And there's no essential but expendable anymore. And we need to say that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
I fully agree, and I'm really hoping that that is one of the dialogues that continues after this all goes, is looking at that lens on who really kept us going during this time and the full continuum of who kept us going. Again,
If you stayed home, you were not essential. Yeah.
correct. Right,
you
right,
know?
right. Exactly, exactly. I think the other conversation, which has gotten some attention, but I hope it's making people think, especially white people like myself, is the whole advocacy now for everyone when they're going out to wear a mask, to wear a bandana, to be safe, and how, in our culture, in our country, in the way that it is, it really isn't something historically that, certain folks can feel safe and comfortable doing. So, Reverend, could you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that that's an important conversation to hopefully put some ahas in people's heads, that maybe, hadn't thought about that.
I wore my mask. It was sunny out. I put on my sunglasses and my Brooklyn Nets baseball cap,
Mhm.
and I posted it on Facebook. I thought I was making an example of saying, hey, wear a mask, wear gloves, be protected, cover your eyes. The pushback I got, some was like, oh, that's great, you look really fashionable. But I had colleagues that said, no, you're putting yourself in danger because you look too ethnic and you may have doctorate and da 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 da, but you could be a target because someone may think that you mean ill for a store you go into or something, and that may not be a good idea to wear the mask that you have, and so forth and so on. And I've received reports, and I'm so you've read some of the news stories of African Americans, people of African diaspora, who have put on their mask, put on, like you said, all they had was the bandana or some kind of covering, and they were harassed. They were stopped by police. The store owners called up and said, "Oh, there's this suspicious person." So on the one hand, yes, we need to be safe. You need to wear the mask. You need to be covered. Try to cover your eyes and your hands as well. But on the other hand, there has been a price to pay. There has been some negative reactions as a result of that.
Yeah, and this was a very interesting. The mask was a very interesting question for Asian Americans. And if you look at the health statistics and you see that Asian Americans, proportionally have been doing okay. In America, part of it was maybe they were wearing masks and doing these things from the beginning. And quite honestly, before the CDC recommended that everyone wear it, as an Asian American, I thought I had to think twice about wearing a mask because for the first time, many Asian Americans feared for their physical safety when they went out during this pandemic. And wearing a mask indicated to others that you were somehow sick. For Asian Americans, that was not the context. They were not wearing it because they were sick. They were wearing it because they were like, well, this is the safety precaution you should take. But we were aware that if we wore a mask outside, then we'd be like, yo, you're coughing. I'm going to come get you. And that, I think, has been an interesting, I think for many Asian Americans in America, they don't have to think about their race. Many of them don't. And so that's been an issue and a question. And out of this pandemic, for the first time, Asian Americans have had just a little bit, of what African Americans have experienced for hundreds of years in this country, thinking of, should I go to that neighborhood and what time should I go? And do I really need to do that? And we've never had to really think about that. That's just the honest truth. But now we've experienced a little of that. So I'm hoping once again that experience sort of opens the eyes and politicizes your understanding in a way of consciousness of other communities, particularly African American communities, and opens a greater sort of road of empathy, so that we can understand, and because now we understand personally in a way that we never ever have. So that mask has been an interesting cultural sort of question, and now everyone has to wear one, so I can wear one outside. So it's great.
Yes. But I appreciate you both sharing your thoughts on that because, again, I would hope that this is an opportunity for folks to sit back and think and learn and again, and I've been having this conversation for years. The year that I started at the YWCA, one of our board presidents and I both had had children around the same time. And she was a Black woman and, I was a white woman, and our kids are now both 7. And, the conversations that we've had with our children as they've gotten older, we've talked about, how they've been different and how they've had to be different. And I think it's important for our communities to different communities to learn and understand what others are experiencing. And again, as you shared, hopefully increasing empathy and understanding, and then, maybe thinking about when we get out of this time a little bit more about, practices and policies and how, they get, impacted for sure. So let's talk a little bit about families and, we are in our homes together. And, there is a lot of opportunity for conversation, to be had because, you are together. And as I shared with both of you before we went live, even in my house, the news was on and, they were talking about the Chinese flu on the news. And then, the next thing about a day later, I heard my kids talking about, that the virus, came from China and, having to really stop and have a conversation with them about that. Not even, realizing that, they obviously we know they take what they hear around, but, really having to address that. Can you both speak a little bit about conversations that we could be having with family and friends right now about racism while we're self-quarantining?
Yeah, I mean, Joanne Yu, the executive director of the Asian American Federation, and myself wrote a op-ed that appeared in the Daily News, New York, about why calling it the Chinese virus was problematic.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the virus was first identified in China, and it originated there as a fact, or at least as far as we know now. But the question is about how we call it, how we attribute blame, and then how we blame others that we
Mm-hmm.
see around us in our neighborhoods for that. And that has been a difficult conversation. And I think in particular, because it's complicated. The history of race and racial attribution is a complicated one. Many people in America don't know the history. These things have happened before. In 1900 in San Francisco, a bubonic plague outbreak was attributed to the Chinese. And the Chinatown, there was a race-based, sort of like quarantine of Chinatown and forced vaccinations of Chinese and Japanese. So if you don't know the history, then you figure, oh, it's not so bad. We've called it the Lyme disease and Legionnaire's disease. What's wrong with that? And one of the issues that we talked about was, hey, have you ever heard about the American pig flu of 2009? When you think about it in that way, you try to say, hey, why do certain nations get attributed with this? As opposed to, the defense say it's named after certain areas. It's fine. It's just how we do things. Mm-hmm. Well, it's how we used to do things, but that's not how we should do things. And that's not how we do things going forward. And the person in your class who's Asian has nothing to do with that. So those are difficult conversations, I think, for kids, because racism is very simple in some ways. So like you can just sort of ingest it and it just becomes part of how you see the world. And I think that talking through people's perspectives is the most important thing for understanding coming out of this.
I would suggest that as a family, if you're a white family or a black family, that you make a pledge that once we return to the new normal, that you would take an Undoing Racism workshop, to have an appreciation of an analysis of racism, to understand the difference between racism versus bigotry versus individual acts of prejudice, so that you can really get your teeth around the history of racism. It didn't just happen. As Chris said, there's a long history. There were laws and policies that were put in place to take us to where we are now. Because you're at home, you might want to read White Rage, which is one of the books that's out there. Mm-hmm. And it talks about every time, if you read White Rage, it says that this current experience politically was predictable, that the history of America shows that every time there were significant gains by people of the Black diaspora in America, that there was a pushback by the wider white community. And so the book documents that over the course of American history. David Billings has a book, Deep Denial, and there again he talks about his experiences as a white person in America and his aha epiphany moment, if you will. I think that it's important, if you've taken the workshop, to understand and teach our family about privilege. Yes. And how does privilege play out? I've always been touched by Race Matters. When Cornel West talks about having a PhD, being an Ivy League trained person, comes out to Madison Square Garden, can't hail a cab, and that's reality. And talk about, so what is it? How did that happen? When you went through all the right hoops, you went to the right schools, you're published, you're tenured, and all of that, but you're still treated as a Black person with all that goes with that. So to have those kind of conversations while you're quarantined at home. And there are lots of websites that give really accurate, good information about how structural racism has created the white-black wealth gap, the education gap, if you will, the technological gap. I mean, we're learning that at least half the children in our urban cities are not learning during this time. They don't have access to technology. They don't have people that can help walk them through the lesson plans, not receive the lesson plans that we're being told that they receive. So having those kind of conversations, I think, will be helpful.
Well, and Reverend, as you I'm sure know the YWCA has actually sponsored an Undoing Racism training in our community. It was the first time we brought it into Bergen County, and we are committed to continuing to bring it. And that was with the generosity and support of our Bergen County executive, who helped fund that project through county funds. And so we hope to continue that effort. I agree, and we will link both of your organizations and some of the references that we're making today to this post, so that those watching can easily access this information. But I would encourage anyone to take the Undoing Racism training. I know it was very important, for me personally, but I think very important for our community to have brought together the 25 people that that were, all of different races, different ages, different walks of life in terms of the types of work we all did, but together, now started the process of bringing that to locally into our community. So as we start to close, our time together, just maybe if you could each share a thought, I'm curious to hear, as we do return to our new normal, what is something based on this experience that we're living in now that you hope really kind of gets the light continued, the spotlight continued to be shined on, and that it does get its attention, especially as we're going towards November. And, one of the issues that can hopefully encourage and inspire us to register to vote if we haven't, and actually vote if we are registered.
The pandemic is an opportunity to remake society. Great cataclysmic events have always reshaped society. World War II, finally laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement in America to finally achieve a greater sense of what America should be. And that was 100 years delayed. So the Great Depression resulted in many, many worker protection laws that would have never been possible were it not for the Great Depression, which led to a great sort of lack of belief in sort of unbridled capitalism. And we might be in that era again. So we really need to rethink how do we protect our workers, that every worker that we don't value now is actually essential, and that every worker is part of a chain that allows us to live our lives. And so we need to value them. So I think that we all need to be focused on remaking the world in a more fair and just way. It's really basic, but we're not there now.
Yep.
So this is a chance to get there.
That's great. Thank you, Chris.
Articles in the Financial Times, in the Atlantic, and the footnote to what Chris just said. And that clearly we're in a paradigm shift. And in the midst of a paradigm shift, we want to make sure that we're part of the architects that help to shape that paradigm shift. We're not just reacting to what's already happened, but we're helping to craft and shape that paradigm shift.
Well, I thank you both for sharing your thoughts. And as I started this and shared, our goal with conversations like this, and we would like to continue talking to both of you and on these topics and others. Our goal is that we have inspired and engaged somebody watching to take action, to become civically engaged, to understand that we all can make a difference, and that collectively we have power for sure. And that especially right now, being registered to vote and taking action and learning about the issues that are important to you, getting educated on them, to you, to your family, to your business, to all of the areas of your life, all the roles that you play. It's key. It's key in making that more fair and more just society, that we're talking about. So I thank you both for being so candid and for sharing your thoughts. Those of you watching, this was an important conversation. I know that everyone can't always make them when we're having them. The beauty of this platform that we use is now it lives on our Facebook page. You can share it with your friends and family. You can encourage people to go back and watch it. We will link all the key resources that we've discussed here today, and maybe some of the books and definitely programs like Undoing Racism here, so that folks can get information. Now that we're home like this, depending on your circumstance and, what's happening around you, you may have some time. And if you do, this is definitely a good way to utilize it to educate yourself more on these issues. We hope that you can join us tomorrow. Our Bergen County Black Business Network will be with us, as well Carithia Oates from that program, and Tevra Francis, who is from the publisher Bergen and Color, will be joining us with our Friday focus on small businesses. And we look forward to that conversation with them. We have a full agenda next week for you to join us as well. And also, we look forward to next week you learning about the winners from our Literary Voices contest, which our students in our community have brought forth some amazing and impactful poetry and artwork to share and manifest kind of their thoughts about civic engagement and stand against racism in these mediums. And we look forward to sharing the winners of that contest with you next week. So again, this is a crucial year with the census and with the elections. Please make sure you're counted in both areas. You can go online and do your census application very quickly. You can drop it in the mail. You can do the same with, all the needs for the upcoming elections as well, with voter registration and so forth. And we do encourage you to take that time. As I keep sharing with everyone, please mind your mind. These are strange times. When you need to plug in, do so. When you need to unplug, do so. Please take care of yourself. Stay healthy. Stay strong. And we stand with you wherever you are today, and hope for us all to get to a healthier and better day quickly for all. Have a great day, and we will see you again soon. And thank you so much, Reverend and Christopher, for taking the time with us today. So grateful for this time with you. Bye-bye all. Take care.